pie secret. The first time Mrs. Higgins offered me a slice of her special pie, the stench of formaldehyde was so thick it nearly curdled the milk in my glass. But in a town like Hollow Creek, where secrets festered longer than winter chills, politeness trumped common sense. I took a bite, the sickly sweetness clinging to my throat like a bad omen. Mrs. Higgins, a skeletal figure with eyes shrouded in perpetual sorrow, erupted into a chilling laugh. "Oh, it pleases your palate. A cherished family secret handed down from my grandmother's time." I managed a tight-lipped grin, the acrid aftertaste of embalming fluid roiling my insides. Hollow Creek's residents murmured about Mrs. Higgins and her peculiar pies, yet these murmurings remained hushed whispers. No one dared to voice their suspicions aloud. As days melded into weeks, the special pie became a frequent treat. Each mouthful was akin to Russian roulette. Sometimes it was filled with harmless blackberry, while other times it held an unsettling mixture that tasted eerily of lilies and decay. Fear gnawed at my nerves, but the oppressive silence that hung over Hollow Creek kept me mute. On a night devoid of moonlight, I was roused by a guttural scraping outside my window. Peering through the curtain gap, I spotted Mrs. Higgins laboring in the graveyard, her shovel glinting like an exposed bone. The sight stirred a morbid curiosity within me that waged war against fear itself. What secrets lay buried beneath that cold earth? The next morning was tainted by the unmistakable odor of formaldehyde. Mrs. Higgins proffered another slice of pie with a victorious gleam dancing in her eyes. This time there was no doubt, not from the smell but from spotting a gold tooth nestled within the filling, identical to one gleaming in last night's moonlight. Fear strangled my scream before it could escape my throat as I flung the pie across the room where it splattered against the wall, revealing an arcane symbol hidden under peeling wallpaper. Mrs. Higgins's laughter echoed around the room, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. "At last you understand. Our town craves sustenance and I provide it. You either join us or become part of the feast." Terror lent wings to my feet as I bolted out into Hollow Creek's winding streets. Every shadow came alive with the horrifying secrets I had unearthed, every whispered tale wielding a bone-chilling reality. The scent of formaldehyde clung to me like a morbid cologne, marking me as both an accomplice and target. My flight from Hollow Creek was a whirlwind of blind running and ignored cries for help until I found myself trapped in the graveyard, surrounded by Mrs. Higgins and her followers forming a grotesque circle, their eyes alight with ravenous anticipation. As they lunged toward me, the moon, which had been hidden behind clouds for weeks, made its appearance, bathing everything in an otherworldly light. Their gold teeth glinted under the moonlight, revealing their true form. Not human, but reanimated corpses kept alive by Mrs. Higgins' unholy pies. A gasp ripped through me as realization hit. The moon was their Achilles heel, while Mrs. Higgins' disgusting dessert kept them alive. In a desperate bid for survival, I seized a shovel and led them on a chase through the town square, scrambling atop an aged statue at its center, just as the moon disappeared behind clouds again. The townsfolk snarled in frustration, their monstrous hunger conflicting with the pull of the moonlight's absence. With one final leap of faith, I landed atop a nearby house just as they turned on one another in a ravenous frenzy. I left Hollow Creek that night with the taste of metallic sweetness lingering on my tongue and screams echoing in my ears, forever ingrained in my memory. While Hollow Creek's residents may have been consumed by their hunger, the secrets remained buried deep within the earth, waiting for the next naive soul to sample the special pie. Late-night growls. The rhythmic chanting began at precisely 3:13 a.m. every night. Not words, but guttural growls that vibrated through the thin walls, emanating from Mr. Crowley's apartment. At first, I dismissed it as late-night karaoke gone wrong, but the melody never changed, and the shadows dancing behind his dusty windowpane took on increasingly disturbing shapes. The enigmatic Mr. Crowley was a puzzle wrapped in a riddle, a solitary figure who had slipped into our neighborhood years before, his arrival heralded by hushed rumors of peculiar habits and alien relics. His existence was largely nocturnal, his only public appearances being his midnight jaunts to the local bookstore specializing in the occult. The recent addition of late-night chants echoing from his dwelling added an extra layer to the unease he inspired. One oppressively dark night, curiosity overcame my fear like a moth irresistibly drawn to a flickering flame. I found myself creeping toward his door, lured by the low, rhythmic drone echoing from within. To my astonishment, the door yielded easily under my touch, revealing an icy gust scented with the sharp tang of incense and an unfamiliar odor that made my nose twitch. His living space was bathed in a sallow light cast by trembling candles that threw monstrous shadows on the flaking wallpaper. Floating dust particles sparkled in midair, caught in an eerie radiance that spilled from a circle and traced onto the well-worn rug. At its heart stood Mr. Crowley himself, eyes shut tight as he recited his chant with an intensity verging on madness. He was garbed in a frayed robe. Strange symbols were etched into his pallid skin in what appeared to be a foreign script. Surrounding the circle were unidentifiable objects pulsating with an otherworldly luminescence. A chill colder than any draft prickled my skin, and I retreated hastily, leaving behind me an open doorway and indelible images seared into my mind. Sleep eluded me during those nights as Mr. Crowley's chanting invaded my dreamscape, morphing into horrific visions of squirming tentacles and nameless gods. My waking hours were consumed by an obsessive need to comprehend what I'd seen. It was as though I was in a tug-of-war between a morbid fascination and the instinctual urge to escape. One afternoon, unable to endure the mounting suspense, I sought solace within the musty confines of the occult bookstore. The proprietor, a woman with penetrating eyes and an inclination for enigmatic statements, listened attentively as I recounted my experiences. "That's an invocation chant used by an ancient cult," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They aim to rip open a passage to a dimension that defies our understanding, a realm steeped in unfathomable darkness." Her revelation sent shivers down my spine. My curiosity had unleashed something dreadful. What I'd seen were merely forerunners of something far more terrifying. Fueled by desperation and armed with her warnings and a crucifix, my feeble shield against this unknown terror, I returned to Mr. Crowley's dwelling that night. As I approached his door left carelessly open, the chanting reached its peak. The atmosphere was electric. It felt like reality itself was on the brink of rupture. I stormed in, brandishing my crucifix like some ill-equipped knight facing an invisible foe. Mr. Crowley's eyes flung open, blazing with an unholy light. The symbols adorning his skin glowed blood red. The air around him shimmered while the objects encircling him emitted blinding flashes of light. A swirling vortex formed at the room's center. Terror rendered me immobile when from this portal emerged a monstrous being, tentacles flailing wildly and teeth gnashing ferociously. Mr. Crowley's laughter echoed ominously around us, imbued with a power that seemed capable of shaking the building's very foundations. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, the bookstore owner appeared behind me, her eyes ablaze with arcane energy as she chanted counterspells using symbols tattooed on her arms. The room flooded with a celestial light, challenging the darkness spilling from the portal. The struggle was colossal. The air hung heavy with the palpable tension of opposing forces. The creature roared, its form flickering as it wrestled against her magic. Mr. Crowley's screams filled the air, laced with torment as he was drawn toward the rapidly shrinking portal. With a final surge of power, the portal shut, the air sizzling as the darkness retreated. Mr. Crowley fell to the floor, unconscious, his skin now marked only by faded scars where symbols once glowed. The bookstore owner and I collapsed in exhaustion under the weight of a narrowly averted catastrophe. Mr. Crowley vanished without a trace after that night, but not before leaving behind a permanent scar on my psyche, a chilling reminder of my brush with an unspeakable terror. Now when I hear whispers in the wind rustling through dead leaves, I can't shake off the remembrance of the horrific night I peered into an abyss, and it stared right back at me. The sinister neighbor, Old Man Henderson, lived next door, his yard an untamed jungle of rusted lawnmowers and gnome statues with unsettlingly realistic grins. My dog Sparky disappeared the day I moved in. Mr. Henderson offered condolences, a twinkle in his cloudy eyes and a disturbingly meaty aroma clinging to his clothes. "Don't worry," he chuckled, patting his stomach. "Sparky won't be lonely long." Let's just say, becoming friends with the neighbors wasn't part of the moving plan. The calm night was punctuated by eerie croaks and grunts that seeped from the wilderness of Mr. Henderson's neglected backyard. Each dawn, the gnomes appeared to have shifted positions slightly, their smiles broadening into sinister grins, their glassy eyes reflecting a macabre delight. Slumber turned into a war zone, plagued by nightmares of gnomes reveling beneath a crimson moon. In desperation, I dared to tread on the forbidden terrain of Mr. Henderson's yard. Abandoned tools rusted under the speckled sunlight, their sharp edges threateningly visible. The scent of damp soil mixed with decay overpowered my senses as I ventured deeper. Then my gaze fell upon it, a gnawed bone lying amidst the roots of a gnarled oak tree and Sparky's collar nearby, his name etched onto the worn leather. A wave of nausea washed over me as my heart pounded against my ribcage. As twilight smeared the sky in violent purples and blues, Mr. Henderson's back door groaned open. He stepped out, his face distorted by the lantern light he carried. He paused briefly to inhale deeply, resembling a famished predator on the prowl. "Ah, you found Sparky," he rasped in a voice that scraped against my nerves. "My little buddy makes quite a hearty stew." A cold knot of terror formed in my gut at his words. This wasn't just an eccentric old man, but something far more horrifying lurking beneath human skin. I recoiled instinctively, fear-fueled adrenaline driving me toward my home, when suddenly he lunged at me with laughter echoing from his throat and twisted fingers outstretched. Just then, an agonizing howl shattered the silence of nightfall. From within the shadows emerged Sparky, or what was left of him, matted fur slick with an unidentifiable substance, eyes burning with preternatural light. He snarled, baring his teeth, and launched himself at Mr. Henderson, his once docile nature replaced by savage ferocity. In the ensuing pandemonium, I clambered over the fence, the sounds of snarls and spine-chilling screams reverberating in my ears. I didn't halt my frantic sprint until I was safely on the main street, tears blurring my vision. The following morning brought news of Mr. Henderson's mutilated remains discovered by local law enforcement. Sparky had disappeared into the obscurity of nightfall. The gnomes were now devoid of their eerie smiles, but the smell of raw meat mingled with damp earth still hung heavy in the air, a truth best left undisturbed in that nightmare-infested yard. I relocated shortly thereafter, haunted by silent screams from stone gnomes and Sparky's monstrous growl imprinted onto my memory. The lesson was carved deep within me. It is wise to maintain distance from certain neighbors and keep some doors firmly bolted shut. For beneath layers of normalcy lurks an insidious darkness ready to devour any unsuspecting soul who dares to lift the veil of pretense. And sometimes, even a cherished pet can become a horrific reminder that there are entities better left undiscovered than unearthed. Blinds wide shut. Mrs. Peabody always kept her blinds shut, even on the sunniest days. But sometimes, just sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse through a crack. A flash of something inhuman, something not quite right, reflected in the polished mahogany furniture lining her living room. The whispers started soon after, carried on the wind like dead leaves, about strange rituals, about sacrifices under the blood moon. Initially, I brushed off the murmurs as mere tittle-tattle of a small town, sparked by the ennui of rural living and Mrs. Peabody's peculiar hermit-like behavior. Then arrived the odor, a loathsome blend of decay and unidentifiable spices that slithered beneath my door like a poisonous snake. It permeated my garments and invaded my dreams, serving as an incessant reminder of the concealed atrocities behind Mrs. Peabody's perpetually shut blinds. Curiosity gnawed at me until one moonlit night when I finally succumbed to it. Stealthily approaching her window, I managed to take a peek through a slight opening in the curtains. What met my eyes chilled me to my core. In the middle of her room stood Mrs. Peabody atop a sigil sketched in chalk, uttering incantations in an alien language that grated against every fiber of my sanity. The flickering candlelight around her threw grotesque shadows on the walls, unveiling cages filled with twitching creatures of abnormality. At the heart was an altar bearing a silver chalice brimming with a thick liquid that gave off an otherworldly luminescence. I stifled a gasp as realization dawned upon me. She wasn't just some harmless old woman. She was something far more sinister, a gateway to unimaginable horrors. Terror urged me to bolt, but morbid fascination held me rooted in place as I watched her plunge a ceremonial blade into one caged creature whose screams reverberated through the night, a tormented soul being devoured. The moment its blood touched the chalice, darkness pulsed throughout the room. Mrs. Peabody's laughter morphed into an inhuman symphony of ravenous whispers. The being turned toward her, its eyes aflame with an unholy fire. Instead of fear, Mrs. Peabody's face exhibited a perverse reverence. The entity reached out for her, and she willingly spread her arms, offering herself to the horrific apparition. I ran then, but the memory of Mrs. Peabody's gruesome embrace was seared into my mind. Weeks passed by with the stench still lingering in the air, an ever-present reminder of the malevolence lurking behind those closed blinds. Finally, I could no longer hold my silence, and I confided in the sheriff about what I had witnessed. He dismissed me outright, as did most townsfolk whose fear was overshadowed by disbelief. But some believed me, their eyes flickering with dread. Underneath another blood moon, Mrs. Peabody's ritual commenced again. This time we were prepared. A band of us armed with rudimentary weapons and driven by desperation stormed Mrs. Peabody's house, leading to a savage and bloody battle between us and shadows. We succeeded in shutting down the portal, but not before one of our own was torn apart by the entity. His agonizing screams intertwined with the entity's unearthly laughter, serving as a grim reminder of our audacity's price. Mrs. Peabody disappeared into the darkness she had summoned, leaving behind the scar of evil. Some doors should remain forever closed, some whispers left unanswered. Even now, that house sits empty, and every time a blood moon rises, I feel a sense of unease as I catch fleeting movements from behind the shut blinds. And if I listen carefully enough, I can still hear Mrs. Peabody's incantations and the wails of the being within, eager to claim another soul. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. See you next time. Thank you for watching.